Hey writers, for our discussion of how to provide an outline for your research paper, how to produce an outline for your research paper, I want to start with this week's EQ because I've given you a few examples of components to think about. So for your EQ this week, I want you to answer 4 questions using your own information. So the first is, what is your working thesis at this point? In other words, what are you trying to prove with the paper? So I've given you the example. So remember, my organization was colleges or institutions of higher education. And my research question was, how will teaching and learning be impacted by the shift to remote learning, right? So how would the habits of teachers be changed? So my working thesis at this point, if I were a student writing for this class, would be that the shift to remote learning resulting from social distancing measures put in place to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 will lead to more short-term course offerings, larger class sizes, and increased spending on technology at institutions of higher education. So again, you are not a fortune teller, right? So this is something that this is an opinion that you are coming to based on the research you've gathered to this point. And I'll walk you through some of the resources that have helped me to sort of get to this working thesis. So the second point here, what main ideas are you planning to use to support this larger point? So in other words, what are the main points of emphasis that you're going to talk about throughout the body of your paper to help answer this question or to help support this thesis? So obviously we can get those right from the thesis, right? So my first point would be looking at course offerings. So if my idea is that remote learning is going to lead to more short-term course offerings, that would be my first paragraph, and I will state that claim again, and then I will provide examples from my sources to back up why I think that is. My second point would be looking at class sizes. So maybe looking at class sizes prior to remote learning and looking at class sizes during remote learning and how we think that might shift based on projections. And then my last point would be spending it on technology. Now, as I say in bullet point 4, there are some terms that you're going to need to flesh out or define more for your readers to really understand what you're talking about. So with course offerings, as a teacher, I'm thinking of that in terms of 16-week courses. So our course, the last the full semester, 12-week courses that start a little later or start, right on time and end a little earlier. 5-week courses like the math modules, or 4-week and 2-week courses that are really compressed. So maybe intersession courses. So I would need to define that for an audience who does not consist largely of teachers, right? You may not understand what a course offering is if you're not in the world of academia. With class sizes, same thing. Our classes are usually capped at 25 at Butler. At WSU, when I was teaching there, classes, a lit class, for instance, might be capped at 40 people. A lecture hall class might be capped at hundreds of people. It really does depend on the institution and on the class itself and its purpose. So for us, I might think about whether or not the shift to fully online learning allows us to have a higher cap, so more than 25 people, because we don't have to worry about the physical space of a classroom and how many desks we can fit into a classroom, right? Because we are all learning from the comfort of our own homes, you may have an increase in that cap. Okay, and then lastly, increased spending on technology. Again, I would want to define what technology looks like in this academic context. So I could be thinking about software. So whether that's software to track, whether or not people log in, or software to track attendance, or computers. So maybe we decide to go to remote learning across the country, and people don't necessarily have laptops at their homes. So do the colleges then provide those? That could be something to talk about. If we go back to face-to-face classes, do we need more projectors? How do we handle database access? So remember, when you go to ProQuest or EBSCO or any of the Butler Library databases, you have institutional access to that because we have paid into it, and those are very expensive databases. So my thesis suggests that there may be increased spending on those kinds of resources as we move to a more disjointed remote experience. So again, this is a working thesis, and your thesis may, if you have it mapped out at this point and you're not all the way through your research, your thesis may change, and it can change. And it should change with the research that you do. All right, so if you have the perfectly worded thesis, please don't get too attached to it at this point if you haven't finished reading all of your articles, right? Or if you haven't finished engaging with all of your sources, because you should really let the research guide your perspective rather than it being the other way around. Okay, so once you've got a thesis, so again, my thesis would be that remote learning is going to lead to these three changes: more short-term courses, larger class sizes, greater spending on technology. So then you want to move those ideas into something of a more specific outline. So we talked about a more basic outline, right, where you've got that intro that narrows to the thesis, and then your body sort of breaks out those thesis points. And within each paragraph, you are going to start off with a topic sentence that lays out your main point. So you can pull directly from the thesis, and you should pull directly from the thesis for each of those topic sentences. You'll want to restate it a bit, but generally it comes from there. And then the body of your paragraphs within that body section should look like your main claim or topic sentence, then going into, a source to help you explain that, and then explaining how the source ties into your claim or supports your claim, right? So you may only reference one source per paragraph. You may reference more than one. It really depends on how thorough your argument is or how complex it is. You do not necessarily have to have three body points or thesis points. That is just the standard to get you started, right? This is not obviously going to be a 5-paragraph essay. This is a longer paper, so your point should be more fully developed. All right, so some of this will overlap with what I just talked about, but the classic model for an argument starts with an introductory paragraph where you're really going to set the scene for your reader. So you're going to hook them, as we've talked about earlier in the semester. But in our case, you want to avoid just jumping into your claim, because you may have an audience who isn't familiar with what's going on in the world, right? You could potentially have someone who's not been following the news around college closures. And so if you jump right into a claim about how colleges are going to change as a result of remote learning, they won't know what you're talking about. So you may want to start with a quote. You may want to start with some sort of a question, and then you're going to narrow down to your thesis statement. Note here that since this is argumentative, you're arguing that something is going to happen or should happen based on your research, that you need to take a clear stance. You can't just you can't end your introduction in a question, right? Sometimes people like to do that, and that is very wishy-washy. You want to be the authority in your paper. So sample argumentative thesis, this is very basic, but something like this would work for our purposes. The next section is background information. So this is sort of linked to the last portion of the EQ, where I asked what terms or ideas you would need to define. So what basic information would you need? In this section, if I were talking about colleges, I would probably need to give some stats about the number of colleges that have gone to remote. I could talk about which colleges maybe did so sooner and which did so later. And I would talk a lot also about remote learning or online learning and how long that has been in existence and how successful it's been in terms of student and instructor perceptions. So once you have given people enough information to follow your argument, you then want to start presenting your actual ideas based on the evidence you've collected. So notice a lot of these are things we've talked about already. So you can have some firsthand examples here. I did ask you to pick an organization you identify with. So you can occasionally bring in the first person. You just want to avoid most of the paper focusing on your personal experience. So using I. Opinions from recognized authorities. These are going to be your sources, whether they're popular or scholarly. Logical appeals is more of a one or two conversation. Just know you want to avoid things that are not credible and are not passing that crap test that we've worked with in the last couple of weeks. So make your claim in each paragraph, then give your evidence and explain how those tie together. So how that evidence helps to support your claim. You're going to do that as many times as you need to. We haven't talked as much about this yet, but you should address at least some opposition, right? So if I were to make a claim that remote learning and a shift to fully online learning was positive, and here's how it's going to look, I would need to address the fact that that is not a belief held by everyone. Right. So you need to show that you are aware of the full conversation at this point. If you are someone who thinks your organization is doing a really great job, for instance, you may want to read some articles and bring in some perspectives about people who don't agree with that position, right? So people who may think that your organization hasn't maybe adapted as well as they should have. So you don't necessarily have to have two specific opposing views. If you are on the databases, opposing viewpoints may be helpful for a general sort of understanding of how your organization is viewed, but we're looking at something really specific with the pandemic right now, so there's not going to be a lot out there in terms of black and white. Here is a list of what people think about it. You're going to have to really synthesize, which means you're going to have to make connections and come to an informed opinion based on a variety of sources. And then your conclusion. So once you have gone through your thesis points and use your evidence to support those, remember you should always back up your claims with specific evidence. So do not make a claim without supporting it with specific evidence, and always cite that evidence, whether you are paraphrasing it or quoting it. So then your conclusion is, of course, your end. This is a section that people sometimes struggle with. You want to restate your thesis. Don't just copy and paste it. You want to reiterate why people should care about it. You want to propose a course of action. So, for instance, if I thought that we were going to, as colleges, start offering more short-term classes, I might want to stake a claim in terms of whether or not I think that is effective. And then, most importantly, you can either give a call to action or you can show your reader what would happen if people don't take the right course of action. In a face-to-face class, were we together, I would talk to each of you about your outline and your ideas, and we would sort of bounce ideas off of each other organically. That's going to be difficult to do here, especially if you're not getting a lot of peer feedback in the discussion boards. So what I want from you this week for the outline is a working outline that has an idea of what you're going to say in your introduction, what kind of background information you're going to provide, and then what your main points are and how each of your sources is going to fit into those main points, right? So I will post this within this instructor's notes module. I will also give you a link to a couple of other general outlines. Most importantly, though, I want you to just try your hand at this, and I want to be able to comment really directly and thoroughly on whatever you come up with for the outline so that I can help you to flesh it out. So we've only got a couple weeks left. So by the end of this week, I will want to see your outline, and then next week I will ask to see a rough draft of the research paper, right? So I know we're moving sort of quickly here, but we are towards the end of the semester. So give me what you've got, and then in the feedback, I will help to steer you in the right direction and make sure that you are on track with everything. All right. I hope this was at least somewhat helpful. If not, if you want to just have a face-to-face conversation with me about your ideas, if you feel stuck, please email me and we can set up a Zoom conference and we can share our screens like this so that I can see what you're working on and you can see me walk you through it. All right. Have a good week.